Okay, so my name is Joanna Ebenstein, and I'm a multi-disciplinary artist with a background in intellectual history. I run a blog called Morbid Anatomy, a sort of digital Wunderkammer where I, as writer, researcher, and photographer, travel the world, real and virtual, in search of cabinets of curiosity, past and present, medical museums, old and arcane collections, and the history of collectors and collecting, and I report on my findings on the blog. Oops. Too quick. Okay, but I also run the related Morbid Anatomy Library and Cabinet in Brooklyn, New York. This is a portrait of me in my cabinet by a photographer named Shannon Taggart. It was commissioned by a Swedish magazine to do a photograph of me in my cabinet inspired by Siva and his cabinet. I'll go back. It was mostly Shannon's conception. I won't take too much credit. Today I'm going to talk a bit about a few of my projects relating to the history of collections and cabinets of curiosity. I will begin by talking about some recent photography projects about, sorry about that. Lost my place. Some recent photography projects, and end up talking about the Morbid Anatomy Library and Cabinet, my open to the public Wunderkammer experiment. Along the way, I will show a series of images. Whenever possible, I've used my own images in this presentation, and when they are not my own, I've attributed them with a caption. As befits the subject matter, this lecture might be a bit meandering and associative, and I've tried to give images equal primacy with text. I've also chosen not to use captions unless the image shown is not my own, in keeping with the non-labeling spirit of the cabinet. So please, if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask me after the talk. Wunderkammer, or cabinets of curiosity, have a charm and affect all their own. They amaze, inspire, and delight. They thrill and incite curiosity. They invite participation in a direct, multi-layered encounter with artifacts. They confuse contemporary disciplinary boundaries and are comfortable with objects residing in the realms of the liminal, the abject, and the uncanny, the kinds of objects that often intrigue artists the most. It is no wonder, then, that they are of such interest to contemporary artists, not to mention photographers, not to mention contemporary artists, such as Mark Dion, which we heard mentioned earlier, another one of his pieces, fashion photographers, home decorators, and private collectors. Cabinets of curiosity can encompass the entire world, creating a sense of personal order and meaning, and providing objects falling outside the disciplinary divide a space to be collected and encountered. They make human psychology, with its urge to collect and organize, find order in the universe, and with its non-rational susceptibility to the numinous power of objects, visible and tangible in, at least to me, the most fascinating ways. They straddle the borders of early science and religion, replete with objects residing at the border of relic and specimen, votive and artifact. I have long been intrigued by the Wunderkammer and early collections in general, as well as collectors collecting and curiosities in a broader sense. This interest informs most of my own projects as artist, photographer, writer, blogger, curator, and most recently, cabinetist. The idea of the collector and cabinetist serves not only as a subject of much of my work, but also inspires the forms of practice and, when possible, the means of exhibition. In fact, I view photography, one of my primary mediums, as a form of collection and meaning-making through groupings with as much in common with the world of the explorer-collector as with art per se. In fact, I see my work as kind of a contemporary explorer-naturalist, traveling the world, both literal and virtual, and gathering images and data to incorporate into my own cabinet, my microcosmic way of making sense of the encountered world and its wonders. My first large-scale project exploring these ideas was Anatomical Theater, which was an exhibition documenting great medical museums around the world, many of them tracing back to cabinets and including such characteristically confounding objects as the anatomical Venus, the slashed beauty, and allegorical fetal skeleton tableaus. These are all real things that straddle the line, to me, of education and spectacle. On this month-long grand tour that I embarked upon to collect images and data for this project, I met with curators and keepers of museums all across Europe and the United States, photographed back rooms and hidden drawers, also objects on display in the museums in context, where their roots and cabinets of curiosity were often laid bare. That's the Venus again. This is called the pathological cabinet. On this trip, I spent a lot of time thinking about the different ways in which these different kinds of collections, the kind of intentional groupings in the museum front stage, and the random surrealistic accumulations could and did speak. A few curators also mentioned to me in passing about a new phenomenon they had encountered, that of being now often outbid by wealthy private collectors while trying to acquire objects for their museums. This led me to become quite curious about what these private, non-institutional collections might look like, how they might function, and what these powerful private collectors might be collecting. To this end, I began work on a project called Private Cabinets. The aim of this project was, first of all, to find a way to get to actually see and secondarily photograph these incredible private collections. This is a collector in London. And also to test the hypothesis I've been developing, namely that this era, our times, are marked by a return to the notion of the private cabinet, to grand, idiosyncratic, and multidisciplinary privately held collections that harken back to pre-modern cabinets. I wanted to see if this is true, and if so, how these collections might speak differently than institutional collections, and to see what kind of wonders might be in private rather than public hands, and to collect images and data with which to figure out what it all meant. Over the course of collecting for this project, a project which I should mention continues now to this day, I've thought a lot about ideas of the public and private collections. Many times in a private collection, I've found myself trying to imagine a museum that could possibly even hold all these objects. I was going to say it's impossible, but there are some exceptions. I feel like there is a change right now where museums like the Museum of Hunting and Nature in Paris, if any of you have been there, or the Wellcome Collection in London and the Museum of Everything in London are really starting to kind of do much more multidisciplinary projects. So I won't say it's impossible, but rare. And all of this due to the disciplinary divides established or firmed up in the 19th century. There are very few contemporary museums I can even imagine collecting all these objects that comprise these incredible private collections, much less show them together in one place. Some elements might be backstage at the Natural History Museum, never to be shown because of their lack of scientific provenance. Others might be shown in an art museum as a treasure, bits might be found in the Archaeological Museum, and some would have been relegated to the trash bin long ago. But here they exist together in a peculiar harmony, one that favors juxtaposition and personal affect over didacticism, networks over the fetishized singular object, the individual over the authoritative voice. Following are a few photographs from these private Wunderkammers around the world as documented in the Private Cabinet series to give you a sense of what is in these collections. That's a bathroom. This is the director of Pixar's office. My next related project was called The Secret Museum, which was an exhibition of photographs exploring the poetics of museums and collections, front stage and backstage, private and public, and including collections from all around the world. And following are some images from that project. Another recent related project is Observatory, a gallery and presentation space I founded 2 years ago with a group of 6 other artists, inspired by 18th century notions of rational amusement and a commitment to multidisciplinary art. And, there it is. And the yearly Congress for Curious People, which I co-produced with the Coney Island Museum, which is a 10-day series of performances, lectures, and symposia on curiosity and curiosities, broadly considered for the general public. And a few years ago, I launched my newest project, which is the main point of this talk, which is the Morbid Anatomy Library and Cabinet. Here, I've taken my exploration of the cabinet trope further with the founding of my own open to the public Wunderkammer. With and through this collection, my own private collection of artifacts, art, books, photographs, ephemera, specimens, etc., relating to my interest areas that I explore on the blog, such as medical museums, collectors and collecting, early museums, arcane media, natural history, and curiosities, I'm interested in exploring through practice the special things a private cabinet can do that an institutional museum cannot. It can be niche and not cater to the largest number of visitors. It can be personal. It need not be didactic. It can juxtapose by aesthetics and whimsy rather than traditional categories. It can commingle art and science, the sacred and the profane, the high and the low, the scholarly and the sensational. It can house and display forgotten or fallen between the cracks objects and artifacts. It can be, on the one hand, very earnestly a research collection, and on the other hand, just as significantly, a place of inspiration, contemplation, spectacle, and memory theater, just like the old cabinets of old. Ostensibly a research library, the Morbid Anatomy Library, in fact, draws mostly artists seeking inspiration or curiosity seekers. These people seem drawn to the delight of mystery and the ontological confusion of being in a space they cannot easily define. Often people will just turn to me, either they walk right out or they turn to me and just say, "What is this place?" Which I like. I feel the greatest experience I provide at the library cabinet, and the reason people are moved by the space, is this very delightful sense of confusion, which is a rare treasure in the modern world. Although I did not know it when I began this project, I've come to understand the Morbid Anatomy Library as a practice-based experiment getting at my fascination with cabinets and early study collections. Here I can toy with and confound expectations of the ideas of library or museum, notions of the role of librarian, and notions of the public and private. Going back to the inspiration of early study collections, before the rigid disciplinary boundaries of the 19th century were established, I find myself curious what kinds of knowledge, in the broadest of senses, might be produced by idiosyncratic collections such as this one. Collections straddling and subverting accepted disciplinary lines and other boundaries, high and low, treasure and trash, naturalia and artificialia, in the words of the cabinet, important and tact. The library has a current scholar in residence, Evan Michelson, a distinguished private collector and a dealer in, as she puts it, housewares for the haunted home and obscure antiques and oddities. She's also star of a new TV show called Oddities, if anybody's seen it, on the Discovery Channel and Science Channel, which is a reality show about she and her partner hunting for oddities. But that's new. Evan works with the collection, giving object-based meditations at the observatory space and working to develop public programs on topics of cabinets of curiosity, unspeakable objects, and collectors and collecting. My goal going forth is to expand this program, bringing in a variety of scholars and artists in residence to produce new and unsuspected forms of knowledge from this idiosyncratic collection, to use this collection as the base for an experiment for what kinds of knowledge unusual collections might inspire. I am very aware that my interest in Wunderkammer is far from unique, that I am instead, as is being explored by this symposium, very much part of a zeitgeist. I'm often asked why this revival is happening and why now. It is my conviction that the return to the private cabinet and its display techniques, now being utilized not only by contemporary artists, but also, as I alluded to earlier, private collectors, fashion photography, and home decorators, television shows, more, marks a return to pre-modern approaches from a postmodern perspective. The project to categorize, inventory, and encyclopedize the world at the heart of the disciplinary divisions of the 19th century now seem quaint, if not naive or arrogant, to the modern temper. It seems narrow-minded and having left many important stories out. Many people today hold a distrust of any single institutional story, perhaps accelerated by hyperlinks and the seemingly endless reshuffling of information that computers make possible, coupled with a critical stance on science and its self-presentation as politic-free truth-making. There's an increasing interest in the interrelatedness of things and meanings, systems theory, multi-disciplinary school programs, a way of seeing which allows for the complexity and messiness and richness of nature. Further, as our daily lives are increasingly abstracted and mediated by screens, objects, with all their complicated and powerful and specific tangibility and materiality, and especially unique and special objects, such as those treasured by the Wunderkammer, have even more allure. Much like in the age of physical exploration, which fostered the rise of the first wave of great private collections, we are now in an age of virtual exploration, the age of the internet, Google, and eBay, in which great numbers of people have constantly expanding knowledge of the wonders and exotica available throughout the world, an awareness once afforded only to the very wealthy. So perhaps the return to the private cabinet and its display techniques is a marker of a sea change, a paradigm shift, indicating a new interest in the interrelatedness of things and meanings, born of an influx of images and data into our lives, and our need to make sense of it all, to organize these images and ideas into our own personal mental cabinets. And in time, when received dogma satisfies less and less people, we all become, necessarily, curators of our own collections, cultivators of our own sensibilities, discoverers of our own truths, weavers of our own mythos, and gentlemen and women explorers going out into the world and bringing home ideas, thoughts, objects, and artifacts, and curating them into our own collections in which science and ornament, trash and treasure, artificialia and naturalia, mysticism and fact can once again, as in the wide world, be allowed to commingle. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions.
Yeah, I just wondered, it's very interesting, with these images you showed us, the artworks or the curiosities in the images are old curiosities, so they are 19th century.
This is true.
Yeah, that is interesting in itself. So we need that nostalgic element.
I think that's a really important part of it. I think there's something about pre-industrial, not all pre-industrial, but about objects that have a handmade feel or seem to have this kind of patina of age that gives it this magic for people.
Yeah, because then on the other hand, you've got the people who are called hoarders,
right?
Who really collect contemporary stuff, lots of it, and we see that as a society as something, abnormal, something pathological, yeah.
Yeah.
So it's interesting, perhaps, that just by shifting the time scale, you have on the one hand.
Yeah, well, I think there's a more, at least with the collectors that I'm aware of, there's a more considered approach than hoarders. They're not just taking things; they're really trying to, like the early cabinets, I think, say something about themselves and their identity. But it's also, it's considered. It's not random. I don't think. I think it's about this kind of larger mise en scène of space, trying to create this space, if that makes sense. So I think there's a difference. Yes?
I think also to help answer that as a collector myself, a lot of the things that I collect also are of an older age, and that is very important because part of the wonder in them is their history, their past, and to have that in your hand and ponder where, the implications of where it came from, the previous owners, how they saw it and experienced it, supply movement in that piece. So, and the new things are, I know where that came from. So the older the object, the new history will kind of be.
Yeah, I think that's true. It's like another imaginative journey.
Right.
It does, and I think maybe as we have less and less artifacts of the past, these things do seem to speak in some really profound way. Anyone else?
Just one more comment, yeah. It's extremely interesting. Eduardo Paolozzi has got these collections of children's toys and Edinburgh, actually. I think yeah. Which would be something, which certainly it's a cabinet of curiosities, if you want to call it, which has artifacts from the 60s, 70s, rather than something.
That sounds really interesting. Yes?
How does one visit your museum?
One comes to Brooklyn, New York. I can give you my card after. If anyone's interested, just come up to me. I'll give you the information. But it's open from 12 to 6 every Saturday. It's open right now. It's in the Gowanus district of New York, Brooklyn, New York.
Did you make that funnel piece?
No, that was a private collection. That was a, someone was talking about Eric Sancho earlier. Yeah, that was Eric Sancho's private collection. He and his wife were puppet makers, so made their house as a cabinet.
Because it's a funny inverse of the dunce cat.
Oh, I didn't
where,
think about
where
it.
things don't go into the body, but with the funnel, everything goes in.
So have you always collected since a child? Because I'm always really interested in collecting as a very kind of, almost, maybe not everybody, but as a kind of like innate kind of thing that I was collecting shells when I was 6 years old, and then the way to arrange this, so it's not something learned. It's something that
I think to me it's really this kind of crystallization of something really intrinsically human about us. Like the idea of ordering information, which is how we make sense of the world, is made visible in a collection. I think that's the most human thing we do is bring all these things in and try to find pattern of meaning. And I think that's why these things have such an appeal at the time with them.
I was supposed to get also the day. I was really thinking that, of course, there is the idea of wonder, but there is also related to that, like apprehension. It's a little bit about where the world things are. You're fascinated by it, but you're also a little scared by it.
I think that's
and
true.
I think by ordering it, maybe you get also, somewhat of a handle on it. I think that's essentially what you're saying.
No, I think you're right. I think it creates kind of a safe enclosure for it. But I think a lot of these things, they do kind of flicker between ontological categories. I think that's why we're so drawn to them. It's frightening too because it threatens our systems. It threatens systems in general, the idea that we can understand by words and categories, and yet it's thrilling at the same time, I think. Yes?
I think it's interesting, the whole idea of the collector and the sort of network of dealers,
Yes.
museums, and so on and so forth. And that, as I think your point, is very interesting. It's suddenly eBay and a lot of opportunities exist for the average person that sort of destabilizes both the system and consequently the narrative, overarching narrative that the system of its dealers and museums and so on have sort of created.
Yeah, it's true, but it's also interesting. When I first started the project of private cabinets, I was talking to this publisher I used to work with and saying, oh, I'm really worried about, that all these amazing things are now in private hands and not in public hands. He said, well, don't, this is the whole cycle of museums. So basically they start as private collections and then they are donated to museums generally. So this kind of cycle is really interesting to me too, the different places in which these things might have started and end up in an institutional aspect.
People are made aware of it.
Yeah.
Otherwise,
people
the
are.
heirs might say, what is this stuff? I hated to look
Well,
at
this
that.
is true. And this is the problem with a lot of these private collections. Like even looking here, you see a taxidermy dog. What museum would take that? Probably not the museum that would want that. And probably, which museum would keep this collection intact? I can't imagine a collection that would. Is something lost there? I'm not sure. Yes.
I'm wondering what role you think humor plays in many of these collections. Just that taxidermy dog next to the painting. To me, I find these fun and whimsical.
Absolutely. Whimsy is the word I use quite a bit. And I think that is something that institutional collections aren't allowed to do, really. And what's interesting to me, when I started the project, the Morbid Anatomy Cabinet, I've kind of been jealous of all these medical museums that have these amazing collections. And when I meet the curators of these museums, they say they wish they were me, because they can't do what I can do. They have to come up with a defense for showing an object. They can't just show an object and say, we like it, it's interesting. And I think, I don't know, there's just this idea that something is lost there, like only private collections can do this right now, and so we see that there. I think in the future this will trickle into museums such as, you guys talking about your exhibit on play, but I think that museums are starting to see that this is interesting to the larger culture and bring it in, but it's difficult. They have to convince board members, they have to, argue for grants in the United States, at least that they're reaching the largest number of people, that they're educational, and there's something about objects that I think even without an educational framework, they just speak, and there's something so wonderful about being just able to encounter an object, and so many things especially natural history collections are considered data-free, you know, things that can never be shown on display because they don't have data. Those things are lost to us, you know, there's something very tragic about that.